Hey everybody, welcome back to Music Appreciation. Today we are taking a look at chapter 45, a piece called Voiles by the composer Claude Debussy. Returning once again to our music history timeline, we have now traversed the Middle Ages up through the Romantic era, or the 19th century, and with today's material we will be introducing the 20th century. So what makes this period unique? I am venturing to guess that the vast majority of us here in this class were probably born in the 20th century or right at sort of the end of the 20th century. And of course, a lot of technological innovations happened during this time period. We mentioned the 19th century was the period of the Industrial Revolution, so the beginning of modern technology, the steam engine, factories, railroads, increases in sort of the quality of life, people moving to the cities. So we're already starting to see this massive social change happening. And of course, this continues on through the 20th century. So some major advances in technology that affect music. Of course, early in the 20th century, we get the advent of sound recording. And over here, you can see a picture of a contraption known as a gramophone, also called a phonograph, invented by Thomas Edison. And this is one of the earliest ways that music is actually recorded and then can be replayed later on, originally using these wax cylinders here, and eventually those transition into what we know as vinyl records, etc., etc. After that, we get radio, which transmits music all across the country simultaneously, film, television, and then at the tail end of the 20th century, of course, we get computers and later on the internet. So all this means that we have, or people during the 20th century, have much greater access to many more diverse styles and genres of music. They're able to travel the world and hear music from different cultures. So we see sort of a splintering of genres and styles that continues on through the internet age. One of these first styles of the 20th century that comes to sort of define this experimental sort of aesthetic with 20th century music would be a style known as Impressionism. And Impressionism is sort of acts as the bridge between the 19th and the 20th century. So it's a very early, begins in the late 19th century as an artistic movement and carries on through the early 20th century. And this was originally a style pioneered by a group of painters living in Paris who felt kind of constrained by the traditional styles of painting that were popular at the time. It was quite popular to make paintings that looked very photorealistic. You were constantly striving for greater and greater realism in your painting and drawing. And a lot of artists wanted to try something new. They wanted to be experimental. And so this group eventually came to be known as the Impressionists. This was originally an insult given to them by an art critic with the last name Louis, who read a negative review sort of mocking the phrase impressionist. And this word itself comes from this particular painting by the famous impressionist painter Claude Monet. And this painting is titled Impression Sunrise. So Monet intended this to be an impression, exactly that, of a sunrise. It's not supposed to look like a realistic photograph of a sunrise. So we get this sense that there's water up here, the sunrise being reflected in the water, perhaps two small boats right here. It's kind of unclear what's in the background, perhaps some smokestacks like of a factory on land. Maybe these are other ships or boats. It's hard to tell. And so it's supposed to be sort of like a spontaneous, immediate reaction to a sunrise, and then he moves on from it. So you can see in terms of technique, we can clearly see individual paint strokes. The colors are not very well blended. It looks very kind of hastily done, maybe a little bit messy, blurry. And this was a surprise to art critics at the time because this is not a style they were used to. So hence the sort of derogatory term impressionists. So some of these characteristics, to summarize what I just said, in terms of painting, we're looking for short, sketch-like brushstrokes. Contrast between light and dark, which I think we can see pretty clearly here. The sun is obviously quite bright compared to sort of the murky, darker colors in the background. Vague images, unblended colors, and this feeling of spontaneity or effortlessness. Here are a couple other examples of Impressionist painting from around the same time. This is another Monet painting from 1904. It's titled Houses of Parliament. We can sense that, there's perhaps some water right here, the sun being reflected once again, and some sort of stately building in the background. But otherwise, it looks a bit unfinished. It's a little bit vague and hazy. Paul Cézanne is another important Impressionist painter. He has a different take, but similar kind of aesthetic here. Things have been abstracted into kind of geometric shapes. We can tell, of course, there's a tree and a lake and a house in front of some mountains, but obviously not photorealistic. Degas is another famous Impressionist painter. He particularly liked to paint ballerinas. So here we can see a ballerina in the foreground. It looks like she may be coming out from behind a curtain on the stage. It's a little bit hard to tell. It's a quick, spontaneous impression of a particular scene. So how does this correspond to music? Because the Impressionist movement kind of encompassed a lot of different artistic styles, and of course Impressionist painters would have been friends with and shared ideas with poets and writers and musicians and composers. And one of these important composers would be Claude Debussy, a French composer who lived from 1862 to 1918. And he took a lot of these ideas and also incorporated some of his experiences traveling and hearing music from different cultures, and sort of pioneered this impressionistic style in music. So the characteristics really correspond nicely to those in painting. We're going to look for something that sounds kind of static and unmetered and meandering, meaning it kind of just floats there in the air, meanders around slowly, meaning it kind of wanders aimlessly. You're never quite sure where it's going, when it's going to end. And in that sense, it almost sounds kind of improvisatory, like it's being made up on the spot with no end point in mind. Debussy also emphasizes timbre, one of our 8 elements of music, again meaning sort of the tone quality or the color of a particular sound. And he also looks to new sort of systems of tonality that were not common in Western classical music. So in the next couple slides, I'll play you some examples of these non-Western scales. But here's a quote from Debussy that I think nicely summarizes his sort of take his aesthetic with music. He said, music should humbly seek to give pleasure. It is essential that beauty be sensual, that it give us immediate enjoyment, that it impose itself or insinuate itself into us without our making any effort to grasp it. So he felt that music should be, you should let it wash over you, it should be enjoyable and calming, but you shouldn't have to think about it too hard. And of course, that's exactly what we're doing here in this conversation. But hopefully you find the music has that effect on you. So the piece for chapter 45 by Debussy that we'll be looking at today is called Voiles. It's a French word from 1910. And the word voile means, it actually has a couple different meanings. It could mean a veil, like a woman might wear over her face. It could mean a sail, as like a sail on a sailboat. It might mean a curtain hanging in a window. So it gives us this connotation of something kind of light, delicate, airy, fluttering around, floating around. But he leaves this title ambiguous to us. We can interpret it how we would like. And that in itself is very impressionistic. And this piece is written for solo piano. And it's about 3.5 minutes long. And here's a picture of Debussy right there. Now I mentioned timbre and tonality as 2 important characteristics to look out for here. And in terms of timbre, again, the tone quality or color of a sound, we're looking for something that sounds a bit muted, meaning kind of soft, gentle, almost like background type music, nothing brash or harsh or in your face. And he achieves this by notating almost the entire piece as being P, which is the dynamic indication for piano, which means soft. And here's the French phrase actually right here, meaning very soft. So he kind of emphasizes that throughout. And here, even in these first 4 measures of the piece, we see piano has been notated 3 times. So he wants this to be very soft and gentle, much as a veil or a curtain would be. And in terms of tonality, he bases this piece off of what is known as a whole tone scale, which means that we kind of lose our sense of tonality. We lose kind of a home key that we want to return to. So I circled in red right here the first couple notes of this piece, and this is a short kind of fragment of a melody that reoccurs throughout the entire piece. This is about as close as we get to any sort of melody whatsoever, and it's actually just a descending whole tone scale. So this is what it sounds like. I'll play it for you a couple times. I'll play it one more time. So that might sound a little bit strange to your ears and maybe a little bit foreign, and that is because he is basing it off of what's called a whole tone scale rather than our common system of tonality. So early on in the semester I mentioned that Western classical music, and pretty much most of pop music still written today, is based off of a tonal scale of a particular system. So here, for example, we've got a G major scale and an A major scale. And so for a G major scale, we'll begin with G, we'll call that the tonic, we'll end with G, and it sounds like this. Descending. On the second one, an A major scale, same thing. And that should sound familiar to you. It should sound right because that's what most of our music that we hear is based upon. But instead, Debussy takes his travels and his experiences with other musical cultures and incorporates new scales. So if you recall our 5 propositions defining and conceptualizing music that we covered early on in the semester, the 5th proposition was that our own assumptions and knowledge about music are kind of inescapably tied to our own cultural experiences. So the scales I just played for you should sound familiar because that's what we've always heard. But there are other areas in the world that use different scales. So here's an example, a collection of 3 different what we'll call non-Western scales: the pentatonic, whole tone, and octatonic. And I'll play these for you just so you get a sense of what different types of scales are possible. So here's a pentatonic scale. Descending. Here's the octatonic scale, this one down here on the bottom. And then finally, the whole tone scale that Debussy uses extensively throughout the piece Voiles. So those 3 scales may have sounded kind of foreign to your ears. They don't quite go where you would expect them to go, which is exactly what Debussy is aiming for. So if I return here to the first couple measures of Voiles, this section that I just circled right here is actually that very same whole tone scale. And then after that, he kind of surprisingly jumps up, a very disjunct melodic movement, upwards to this kind of high-pitched section. So I'll play that whole thing. And then he repeats that. So already that should sound a bit different to your ears. So I've laid out here a listening chart describing each of the 8 elements of music. So I encourage you next to, after having read the chapter and listen to this video, to please listen to the recording on MyLab. Again, it's about 3.5 minutes long. It's pretty short. And listen for this short fragmentary melody that I just played you several times. That's about as much of a melody as we're going to get. The dynamics, of course, are very soft throughout, mostly notated as P or piano. The rhythm, it is notated in a duple meter, meaning divided into twos, 1, 2, 1, 2. It's pretty slow. But the way that he places the emphasis of the beat in strange places, so it actually kind of feels unmetered. It feels like you can't quite latch onto a particular rhythm. It would be hard to tap your feet along to it. The texture, it's solo piano, mostly one melody with sort of an underlying bass line to it. The timbre is soft, muted. It feels a bit shimmery and light to me. The form we hear as I play it, I'll play it one more time here. Again, that's about as much of a melody as we're going to get. We hear that at the very beginning, and we hear it at the very end, right as the piece is about to finish. So in that sense, we get sort of an A-B-A form, but it's not a particularly clear form. It kind of just, again, meanders around. And in terms of word-music relationships, this is an instrumental piece, so there are no words to correspond with it, although your mind might draw connections between the word voile or veils or sails to the music that you're hearing. So again, please take a look at or listen to this piece on MyLab and try to follow along with this listening chart. Maybe give it a couple listens because it's a beautiful piece. And I hope you enjoyed this example of Impressionist music. Thanks for listening.